Hi everyone, it's Sarah here, and today I'm going to show you how I make my polymer clay roses. And I'm going to be using Fimo Professional in Carmine Red, and I'm going to be using a medium-sized teardrop cutter, and then I have my poker here, which I'll use at the end. And I have already rolled out my sheet of clay, and I've used the thickest setting on my pasta machine. And the reason why I do that is because when I go through and make the petals, I usually press them through in between my fingers. So that's going to thin them out just a little bit. So I like to have the clay a little bit thicker when I start. And I'll show you how I do that as I go. Now I am using Fimo Professional, which tends to be a little bit stiffer than say Fimo Soft or Premo or Sculpty or some of the other brands that are out there. I have tried a lot of different clays, and I actually prefer the Professional. And the reason is because I do a lot of flowers, and I find that it's easier to work with when you do flowers. Every type of clay has, has its benefits. But for me, using the Professional when you do flowers is going to help hold its shape a whole lot better. If you're trying to use a softer clay and you're doing thin petals like this and you want them to stand up and stay, with some of the softer clays, they tend to kind of flop over. You're not going to get as clean of lines when you cut them. They're a little bit more difficult to pick up off of your work surface. So I've always always liked the Fimo Professional the best. And I know there's a lot of debate because it is a little bit more difficult to soften in your hands when you start, and sometimes Fimo can tend to be a little bit crumbly when you first get it. But once you warm it up and you run it through your pasta machine a few times, honestly, I feel like you're going to be much happier with your results in the end with the Fimo Professional. If it's really stiff, you can use something like this. This is Sculpey Clay Softener, and basically it's just an oil. You could also use baby oil or even olive oil to just give it a little bit more softness, but be careful not to use too much because then you run the risk of making it just as soft as those other clays that we're trying to avoid. So just a little tiny, a drop or two is plenty of the clay softener. But I went ahead and I rolled my clay through the pasta machine already, and then I'm going to take my teardrop cutter, and I'm going to be doing a medium size rose, medium to large size rose. This was actually the very first flower that I learned to make when I started using Polymer about 10 years ago. And I use roses for a lot of different things. You can see here I do rose rings, sometimes I do earrings, sometimes I do mini roses, and this one is actually going to be paired up with this one that you see here, and it's part of a necklace that I'm working on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out 13 of these teardrops, and the reason why I do 13 is because I did 13 on this one, and I like to make sure that my roses are similar in size, especially if they're going to be going in the same piece. And this is a pretty symmetrical piece that I'm doing, so I want to make sure that they match more or less, and that they look the same when they're next to each other. And I tend to do that with all of the roses that I make. I always count out the petals. Just so that if I, for example, on my rings, I want to make sure that the size is pretty much consistent on all the rings that I make, so that I don't have some that are much bigger or much smaller than the other ones. So it's just an easy way to kind of keep things organized. And I've lost counts. Let me see here. Okay, we have one extra, so I'll be careful not to use that one. Okay, so what I will do first is I'll usually come in and pick up each one of the petals, and I'll rub my finger around the edges just to get off any of the little crumbles that may have been there when you used the cutter, because sometimes that happens. They don't cut all the way through. And you can see here what I'm doing is I'm just pressing them through in between my fingers, and I'm actually making the clay much thinner than what it came out of the machine as. And I'm not trying to be super careful with it, because if you kind of give the edges a bit of a squeeze and then maybe even just a slight pull, and run your finger over the edge, you're going to give it more of a natural effect or natural feel. And that's going to look a lot better when you're done with your roses. So go through and you'll just soften all of those out in your fingers first. And I tend to go a little bit, quick. My fingers are used to it. But don't worry if you don't go as fast. It's really not a problem. Take your time. And for those of you who have bought my earring making kit, you can actually make these roses with that too. It doesn't have to be the teardrop cutter. You can use the circle. It's fine, because in the end you'll see that we're really only going to be using this top part of the teardrop. So it's just that rounded edge anyway. I just kind of got in the habit and started using the teardrop, so that's where I go. But if you have a round cutter, you can do it just the same. You could also use an X-Acto knife and cut them out by hand. And as long as they're similar in size, it's fine. They don't have to be exactly the same. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and keep flattening these out in my fingers, and I will come back when they're all ready. Okay, so you can see here that I flattened out all of my petals on my work surface. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier is you'll see that I'm wearing gloves, latex gloves. And the reason why I do that is because I don't like to see fingerprints in my clay when I'm done. And because I do a lot of pressing into the leaves, I just find it makes things much easier when you wear gloves. You also notice that some of the color has rubbed off on the gloves, and when you're working with the female professional, these are pure pigments, so you are going to get a little bit more runoff on your hands. And it's not necessarily a big deal. It's not harmful or anything. It's just easier, just for easier cleanup. So I prefer to wear the gloves for that reason, and I just always have. So again, mostly a habit for me. Okay, so what we're going to do is to start the rose. We're going to start off by making our center, which is this petal here in the middle. And what you're going to do is you're going to take one of them and you're just going to flatten it out all the way along the edge like that. And then you're going to start from the pointed tip, so the smaller end, and you're going to just roll it up on itself. And you're going to do that loosely. You don't want a super tight roll, because this is, remember, a rosebud that is opening from the center. All right, and I'll usually keep my finger here at the bottom, and I'll turn towards the bottom rather than turning up towards the top, because you're going to close it off more that way if you roll along the top edge. Okay, and then what you're going to do next is, the rose is basically a spiral. So you're just going to take each one of your petals, and I always like to go over them with my finger one more time just to make sure that there are no fingerprints, or that everything is nice and smooth. And when you start off, this is going to be the most important part, because this is going to determine whether or not your rose is going to be even. So you really want to follow along this line here, and you want to make sure that these two petals are even and about the same height. Otherwise, you'll notice that your rose bud will start to sink down inside the rose as you go, and it's really hard to recover, and then it doesn't look quite as nice. Okay, so you want to do that and keep going around, and I just keep playing with the petals as I go and make sure that they're looking clean and nice, and that they're not super attached to each other. Okay, and then you're going to want to give it a little bit of pressure as you're moving around that spiral. Okay, because that's going to help compress everything together, and it's also going to contribute to the shape of your flower. Okay, so we'll just keep going around and around, and I like to overlap them a bit, so I don't like to put them right here in the center. I do like to overlap them one behind the other like this, and again, it makes things look a little bit more natural that way. And you're going to just kind of keep using your thumb. You're going to be kind of pulling out on the edges just to give it that more of a natural effect. And you can see that when I flattened out the petals in my finger, they're not completely round. You know, they go in, they come out, they go up. But again, I just think that makes it look a little bit more natural. And these roses, of course, are not meant to be an imitation, a realistic interpretation of a rose. These are really just meant to, you know, resemble a rose. They're a stylized concept of a rose, and I just prefer that better for my work. You know, some people do prefer a much more realistic one, but I've always enjoyed this style, and it plays in well with my work, which is very colorful and graphic. We're just going to keep going around. And I might speed this video up a little bit so you don't have to watch, because I'm sure you get the idea here of what I'm doing. And you can see here I'm just kind of using my thumb to roll over the bottom and make sure that it's sticking to the other clay. And you'll see you start to grow a stem down here at the bottom, which we're going to get rid of at the end. But I'll show you how we do that later. Okay. And if this is your first time trying to do this, don't get discouraged. I've been making these roses for about 10 years, as I mentioned, maybe a little bit longer. So, you know, it's pretty second nature to me now, but my first ones were not very nice. Takes a little bit of time and practice to get them exactly how you want them to be. And I noticed this one was a little bit too pointy, so I'm actually just lightly tugging on it. And the clay is elastic enough that it will allow you to do that. So don't be afraid. I mean, you don't want to pull too hard because then you will rip it, but you can give it a little tug and it will be fine. And it just reshapes it a little bit. Okay, a couple more to go. Nope, that one too. Okay. And last one. Oh, actually, never mind. Remember, we cut one extra. I thought that looked like it was pretty much done. Okay, so you can see they're very, very similar in size. Okay, now, normally, or what I do sometimes, depending on what I'm making, for example, if I'm making an earring or if I'm making a necklace where I'm going to string the rose onto a wire or onto some kind of head pin or something like that, then I would take my poker and I would poke all the way through, and you want to try and stay as straight on as possible so that you're not going up into the rose or down below. You just want to try and poke all the way through, and then once you do that, come back around the other side and go in the other direction. I'm not going to do it on this one because the piece I'm working on, these are actually going to be mounted onto another piece of clay, so I don't need holes in these ones. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off this stem here at the bottom. And I'm going to try and get it to, I'm going to try and get rid of this pointed part here because I want it to sit flat once it's mounted onto the other piece, onto the necklace. But you also need to be careful because you want to make sure that all of your petals are connected. So you can even just go back around and make sure that everything is pressed down properly. Everything's going to stay in place once you start to cut. And if you want to play with this shape too, if it's not quite as round as you like, or maybe it's gotten out of proportion a little bit, you can always start to pull from the bottom of the rose, and you can always reshape it a little bit that way, just depending on how thin this little neck part has become. But you can certainly play with it a little bit more and push it in and play with it and model it with your thumbs a bit. All right, so I'm going to take my blade and I'm going to start right about there. Whoops. Make sure you have it on the sharp end, otherwise that's going to ruin your work. All right, and I'm just going to slowly start to glide, and I'm going to twist the rose around as I'm cutting so that I don't distort the shape of it. Okay, and then we go all the way through, and there we go. And we have our rose. Okay, and you can do a little bit more shaping afterwards. The other thing that you can use if you want to is a paintbrush. And you can take the paintbrush and you can come in underneath your petals and you can start to lift them up a little bit more. Okay, and just play with it and just make sure that it's done nicely. And you can see here too, you'll notice that it looks like we could have put another petal there, and if this was going to be a rose standing on its own, I probably would have. But as I mentioned, this is going to be part of another piece, and these two roses are going to be sitting together like this. So I want to give a little bit more room there in the middle so that I can add the other piece, and so that I can make sure that once they're together they have room to sit on the mounted part. Okay, and then last thing I'm going to do, I always love this part, the magic eraser, which is polymer clay, and clean up my ceramic tile. And I love working on ceramic tiles. I think they are the best surface to work on. So if you're working a lot in polymer clay, I would definitely recommend getting one. They really help make work easy. And the other great thing about that is I don't have to move my work anymore. Because I just pop this ceramic tile right in the oven, and I pull it out when they're done, and I don't risk having to move around my pieces and distorting the shape of them at all. Okay, so that's how you do a rose. If you'd like to see any more videos, I'll have some links below. And as I mentioned earlier, I do have a polymer clay earring kit, which you can use to make flowers, to make roses like this. And I'll link that up in the bottom too, if anyone is interested in purchasing that. All right, thanks guys, bye.